When my son and his wife deliberately excluded me from my only grandson's life because of a family disagreement, I discovered they couldn't afford his college tuition despite his academic achievements. So I secretly established a fully funded scholarship in my late husband's name that has now sent my grandson to an Ivy League university, supported 12 other deserving students from underrepresented backgrounds, and created a legacy of education that healed our family wounds when my identity as the anonymous donor was finally revealed during my grandson's college graduation ceremony. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I never imagined that a disagreement over a holiday dinner would lead to my complete exclusion from my grandson's life. At 72, I'd lived through enough family conflicts to know they eventually resolved, given time and goodwill. But this estrangement was different, more absolute, more painful, and ultimately more transformative than I could have possibly anticipated. My name is Eleanor Parker. I raised 2 children, my son Robert and daughter Catherine, in our colonial home in the university town of Westfield, where my late husband James had been a respected economics professor for over 30 years. Our house, with its creaking wooden floors and walls lined with family photographs spanning generations, had been the center of family gatherings for decades, until the rift that would reshape all our relationships. Westfield is a picturesque New England town built around its prestigious liberal arts college, Westfield College. Red brick buildings with white trim and tree-lined paths crisscross the campus where James taught from 1972 until his retirement in 2005. When we first arrived as a young couple, we fell in love with the intellectual energy, the changing seasons marked by campus traditions, and the tight-knit community of faculty families that became our extended support system. The town itself feels like something from a postcard. A white-steepled church overlooking a town square, family-owned shops that have operated for generations, and Victorian homes with wraparound porches where neighbors still gather for evening conversations. Our home, a blue colonial with black shutters just 3 blocks from campus, became known for its open-door policy. Students working on theses, colleagues debating economic theory, and neighborhood children all found welcome at our dining room table. James was a beloved professor, known for mentoring students long after they left his classroom. His economics lectures were famously engaging, drawing students from all majors who would crowd into the lecture hall just to experience his passionate teaching style. He established a modest scholarship fund for first-generation college students, having been one himself. His dedication to education wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal, a core value that shaped our family life. Education is the great equalizer, Ellie, he would often tell me. It's the one thing that once given can never be taken away. This philosophy guided his career and our family priorities. Our home library grew to fill 2 rooms, and dinner conversations centered around ideas rather than possessions or status. I worked as a librarian at the town's public library for 25 years, eventually becoming head of the research department. My career centered around connecting people with knowledge, helping researchers navigate archives, and establishing the library's first digital database. Throughout these years, our home remained filled with books, academic journals, and the constant conversation about ideas that characterized our marriage. Our son Robert followed his father into academia, becoming a history professor at Bridgewater, a university in Rhode Island, about 2 hours from Westfield. As a child, he had spent countless hours in his father's campus office, absorbing the rhythms of academic life. His decision to pursue history rather than economics never bothered James, who believed passion for one's subject matter was more important than the specific discipline. Robert met Claire Harrington during a museum fundraiser in Boston. She was elegant, articulate, and from a family with deep New England roots and considerable wealth. The Harringtons owned a successful investment firm that had managed old Boston money for generations. Claire herself worked as an art curator for a prestigious private collection, a position secured through family connections. Their courtship was swift and their wedding lavish, held at the Harrington family estate with over 300 guests, most unknown to our side of the family. James and I felt somewhat out of place among the politicians, executives, and socialites who comprised Claire's social circle, but we were happy for Robert and welcomed Claire warmly into our family. Their son Ethan, our only grandchild, was born when I was 64, a joy that lit up my world after James had passed away 2 years earlier from heart failure. Holding that tiny boy in my arms, I felt a connection to the future I had feared lost after becoming a widow. In Ethan's curious eyes, I saw echoes of James and the promise of new beginnings. Our daughter Catherine took a different path, moving to Seattle after law school and building a successful environmental law practice. Fiercely independent and driven, she thrived in challenging cases against corporate polluters and government agencies. Her visits east were infrequent but meaningful. She never married or had children, pouring her considerable energy into landmark environmental cases and her close circle of friends. While the geographic distance between us was significant, we maintained a warm relationship through weekly calls and annual visits. After James died, I remained in our family home, finding comfort in familiar surroundings and community connections. The initial months of grief were unbearable. The absence of his voice, his footsteps, his warmth beside me in bed each night left a void that seemed impossible to fill. For weeks, I moved through rooms filled with evidence of our shared life, touching his books, his reading glasses, the cardigan sweater still hanging by the door, as if these physical connections might somehow keep him present. The campus community enveloped me with support. Colleagues bringing casseroles, former students sending heartfelt letters about James's impact on their lives, the college president establishing a memorial lecture series in his name. These gestures provided comfort, but couldn't fill the emptiness of my new reality as a widow after 46 years of partnership. "Mom, you need to get out more," Catherine urged during one of her visits 6 months after James's funeral. "Dad wouldn't want you becoming a recluse in this house." "I'm not a recluse," I protested mildly. "I still volunteer at the library. I see friends for lunch. I'm managing." The truth was more complicated. I was functioning but not truly living. James and I had been partners for 46 years. Without him, I struggled to find purpose in daily routines. Even my relationships with Robert's family felt different, strained in ways I couldn't quite articulate. In those early months of widowhood, baby Ethan became my brightest joy. I visited Robert and Claire's home at least weekly, bringing children's books, handmade blankets, and my eager arms to hold the newest Parker generation. Claire was initially welcoming, perhaps understanding that this connection to my grandson helped ease the grief of losing my husband. For the first few years of Ethan's life, our relationship seemed positive, if somewhat formal. Claire maintained careful control over all aspects of child rearing, specific feeding schedules, limited sugar, educational toys only, but accommodated my visits and allowed me to participate in Ethan's major milestones. I witnessed his first steps, celebrated his first words, and treasured the drawings he created, especially for Gamma, his name for me when he began speaking. The subtle shift in our family dynamic began when Ethan reached school age. Claire enrolled, him in Greenwood Academy, an exclusive private school favored by wealthy families preparing their children for future Ivy League educations. When I expressed surprise at this choice, the public schools in their area were excellent, and Robert himself had thrived in public education. Claire's response was coolly dismissive. "We want Ethan to have every advantage, Eleanor. The connections he'll make at Greenwood will serve him throughout his life. Robert's father may have been comfortable with a state university education, but we have different aspirations for Ethan." The reference to James, who had earned his PhD from Harvard, despite his humble beginnings, stung deeply. It contained the first clear indication that Claire viewed our family's educational values as somehow inferior to her more status-conscious approach. The breaking point came during Thanksgiving dinner at Robert and Claire's home when Ethan was 8 years old. It was our first holiday gathering since James's passing, and I'd brought his famous cranberry relish, made from his mother's handwritten recipe card that had traveled from rural Pennsylvania to his faculty home in New England. "Mom, we appreciate the sentiment, but Claire's already prepared the sides," Robert said when I arrived, taking the crystal dish from my hands and placing it directly in the refrigerator rather than on the elaborately decorated table. "Of course," I said, swallowing my disappointment. "It's just that your father always made this, and I thought—" "We need to create our own traditions now," Claire interjected with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Especially for Ethan's sake." The dining room reflected Claire's meticulous attention to appearance: fine china, sterling silver, crystal glasses, and an elaborate centerpiece that made conversation across the table difficult. Claire's parents, Gregory and Margaret Harrington, occupied the seats of honor, Gregory at the head of the table where James would have sat in our home. Throughout dinner, I noticed subtle shifts in family dynamics. Robert and Claire directed conversation away from memories of James, changing topics whenever I mentioned him. Ethan's attempts to share stories about school projects were repeatedly interrupted by Claire's reminders about proper dining etiquette. The warm, slightly chaotic family meals of the past had been replaced by something more formal, more controlled. "Ethan is showing remarkable aptitude for mathematics," Gregory announced during dessert. "The Harrington analytical mind showing through. He'll make an exceptional addition to the firm someday." "He's only 8, Dad," Claire laughed lightly. "But yes, we're focusing on developing those skills. His math tutor says he's working well above grade level." "The Parker side contributed some intelligence, too," I offered quietly. "James was something of a mathematical prodigy himself. He could have gone into finance but believed education created broader social value." A brief, uncomfortable silence followed before Margaret changed the subject to their upcoming winter vacation in Switzerland. The message was clear: the Harrington vision for Ethan's future took precedence over any Parker family legacy. After dessert, while Claire cleared dishes with pointed efficiency, making it clear help wasn't welcome, Ethan approached me with a school assignment: a family tree project. "Grandma, can you tell me more about Grandpa James for my project? My teacher says I should interview family members about our ancestors." Before I could respond, Claire interjected from the doorway: "Ethan, homework can wait. Besides, we've already discussed focusing your project on my side of the family, since we have more complete records going back to the Mayflower." "But I want to include Dad's side too," Ethan persisted. "And Grandpa James was really important. Dad said he was super smart and helped lots of students." "Well, perhaps another time," Claire said, her tone final. "It's getting late, and Grandma will be driving home soon." That exchange might have remained a minor family tension, except for what happened as I was preparing to leave. Ethan ran to his room and returned with a photograph, one I'd given him of James in his academic regalia, surrounded by graduating students he'd mentored. "Grandma, can you tell me who these other people are?" he asked eagerly. I sat down on the entryway bench, delighted by his interest. "These were special students your grandfather mentored. This young woman became a Federal Reserve economist. This young man founded a microfinance program in rural communities. Your grandfather believed education was the most powerful gift we could give anyone." Ethan's eyes widened. "That's so cool. Dad says I'm smart like Grandpa. Do you think I could be a professor too someday?" "You can be anything you set your mind to," I assured him. "Your grandfather would be so proud of your curiosity." Claire appeared in the hallway, her expression tense. "Ethan, it's time for your bath. Say goodnight to Grandma." After Ethan reluctantly headed upstairs, Claire remained, her posture rigid. "Eleanor, I need to ask you to stop filling Ethan's head with these idealized stories about academic life. Robert and I have different aspirations for him. Different aspirations? I echoed, confused. I was just answering his questions about his grandfather. We're hoping Ethan will eventually join my father's investment firm. The connections and opportunities there are significant. This obsession with James and academia undermines the future we envision. I felt a flash of indignation. He's 8 years old, Claire. Surely it's too early to map out his entire career path. And James was his grandfather. There's nothing wrong with him knowing about that legacy. The issue, Claire continued as if I hadn't spoken, is that you're presenting this romanticized view of academic life, endless books and meaningful work, without acknowledging the financial realities. Robert had to take family support to pursue that path. We want more practical success for Ethan. The conversation deteriorated from there. What began as a disagreement about Ethan's future evolved into broader tensions. Claire's thinly veiled suggestions that James and I had prioritized intellectual pursuits over financial security, Robert's awkward silence as he failed to mediate between his wife and mother, and my own increasingly defensive responses about the value of education beyond monetary measures. Perhaps, Claire said finally, her voice cold, we all need some space to reset expectations about family involvement and influence. I drove home that night with tears blurring my vision, replaying the conversation and wondering how a simple holiday dinner had escalated into what felt like a fundamental rejection of the values James and I had built our lives around, and by extension, a rejection of me. The space Claire suggested expanded into weeks of uncomfortable silence. My usual Sunday afternoon visits with Ethan were canceled with vague excuses. Phone calls went unanswered or were hurriedly concluded. When I finally reached Robert directly at his university office, his explanation was halting and clearly uncomfortable. Mom, Claire feels that some boundaries would be healthy right now, just until things settle. Boundaries about what exactly? I pressed. I haven't seen Ethan in nearly a month. It's complicated, he sighed. Claire believes your influence might confuse Ethan about the direction we want for his future. Her parents are very involved in educational planning, private school applications. It's a whole trajectory. And there's no room in this trajectory for his other grandmother? For his grandfather's memory? Robert's silence provided the devastating answer. The weeks of separation stretched into months, then years. My attempts to maintain connection were rebuffed with increasing finality. Birthday gifts were acknowledged with formal thank you notes in Claire's handwriting. Christmas invitations came with specific time windows for my visit, always scheduled around Claire's family's longer stays. Ethan's school events, sports games, and milestones were shared after the fact, if at all, through Robert's infrequent guilty phone calls. Catherine, during her visits east, acted as reluctant intermediary. It's ridiculous and cruel, she fumed, after another failed attempt to reason with her brother. Claire has completely isolated Robert and Ethan in this bubble of privilege and ambition, and Robert is too conflict avoidant to stand up to her. I just want to know my grandson, I said simply. To be some small part of his life. I know, Mom. And Ethan asks about you. Robert admitted that much. But Claire has this stranglehold on the family narrative. Everything filtered through her perspective, her family's expectations. As painful as the estrangement was for me, I worried more about Ethan, a bright, curious child now subjected to a narrowly defined path determined by his mother's ambitions rather than his own interests and talents. The few glimpses I caught of him at carefully orchestrated holiday gatherings revealed an increasingly reserved boy, his natural enthusiasm seemingly dampened by excessive expectations. During one brief Christmas visit when Ethan was 12, I managed a few moments alone with him while Claire was occupied with her parents. "How's school going?" I asked, treasuring this rare opportunity for direct conversation. "It's okay," he replied with a shrug that didn't match the academic passion I'd witnessed in his younger years. "I'm getting all A's. That's wonderful. What subjects do you enjoy most? His eyes darted toward the doorway before answering quietly. I really like creative writing and history. But Mom says those are just electives. The important classes are math and business fundamentals. All knowledge is valuable, I offered gently. Your grandfather used to say that education should open doors, not close them. A genuine smile briefly illuminated his face. Dad told me Grandpa James was really smart, that he helped lots of people go to college who couldn't afford it. Before I could respond, Claire appeared in the doorway. Ethan, your grandfather Harrington wants to discuss your summer internship options. She fixed me with a pointed look. Family business matters. The clear message, I was not considered family in matters that actually mattered. By the time Ethan reached high school, my direct contact had dwindled to almost nothing. The complete separation crystallized around his 16th birthday when I received a brief email from Robert explaining that the family would be celebrating with a trip to Europe organized by Claire's parents. My birthday gift, books on world history I'd carefully selected, was declined with the explanation that their luggage would be strictly limited. That night, sitting alone in my living room surrounded by photographs of the family I had lost access to, I faced the painful reality that I had become a ghost in my grandson's life, present in biology, but absent in any meaningful way. The values James and I had cherished, education, curiosity, service to others, were being systematically erased from Ethan's understanding of his own heritage. The estrangement might have continued indefinitely if not for a chance encounter at the college library where I still volunteered. While helping organize an alumni fundraising event, I overheard a conversation between two administration officials reviewing scholarship applications. The Parker boy has an outstanding academic record, perfect SAT scores, valedictorian, impressive writing samples, but the financial need is significant. The parents indicated they can contribute almost nothing toward tuition. The name caught my attention immediately. Excuse me, are you referring to Ethan Parker, Robert Parker's son? The administrator looked surprised at my interruption. Yes, that's right. Do you know the family? Ethan is my grandson, I explained, my heartbeat quickening. But there must be some mistake about the financial situation. My son is a tenured professor, and his wife's family has considerable resources. The administrators exchanged uncomfortable glances. I'm afraid the application clearly indicates financial hardship. There's even a personal essay about educational aspirations despite family financial setbacks. Quite moving, actually. After they moved away, I sat down, trying to process this information. Robert and Claire had always presented an image of affluence and privilege. Claire's family connections and Robert's academic position had supposedly secured Ethan's path to the elite education they'd planned since his childhood. What had changed? That evening, I did something I had never done before. I called Catherine's law firm contacts and asked for a discreet background check on the Harrington family businesses, Claire's parents' financial empire that had been presented as Ethan's guaranteed future. 3 days later, Catherine called with the results. Mom, it's worse than we thought. The Harrington investment firm suffered massive losses in a failed development project. They've been quietly selling assets for the past 2 years. The family home is mortgaged to the hilt, and there are multiple tax liens pending. They're essentially insolvent. And Robert? I asked, my worry for my son overriding years of hurt. His university is undergoing major budget cuts. His department is being consolidated, and his position is vulnerable. They're house poor, trying to maintain appearances while drowning in debt. The revelation explained so much: Claire's increasing rigidity, the canceled family vacations attributed to scheduling conflicts, Ethan's summer internships that were actually jobs at his other grandfather's remaining business interests. Most heartbreaking was the realization that Ethan, brilliant, hard-working Ethan, might lose his chance at the education he deserved because of pride and pretense. The family had cut me out entirely, rather than admit their financial struggles or accept help from the mother-in-law they had systematically pushed away. That night, I sat in James's old study, surrounded by his economics books and the photographs of students whose education he had supported throughout his career. A plan began forming, one that would honor my late husband's legacy, provide for my grandson's future, and perhaps, eventually, heal the family wounds that had festered for so long. "What would you do, James?" I whispered to the empty room. The answer seemed to come from the very books lining the shelves, from the life we had built together. Education creates possibility. Knowledge transcends circumstance. Generosity outlasts injury. The next morning, I called my financial advisor and my attorney. The path forward was clear, though not without risk. I would establish a scholarship foundation in James's name, with my grandson as its first recipient. Ethan would receive his college education, but he would never know the funds came from the grandmother he had been taught to forget. The James Parker Education Foundation began as a simple idea, but quickly evolved into something far more complex. Creating an anonymous scholarship that would specifically benefit my grandson without raising suspicions required careful planning, legal expertise, and absolute discretion. Fortunately, decades of living in a college town had given me connections to exactly the right people. My first call was to Martin Goldstein, a retired law professor who had been one of James's closest colleagues and remained a trusted friend after his passing. Over coffee in his book-lined study, I explained my situation, the family estrangement, Ethan's academic promise, and the financial crisis his parents were concealing. "Let me understand correctly, Eleanor," Martin said, removing his reading glasses. "You want to establish a scholarship that will specifically benefit your grandson, but you don't want him or his parents to know you're behind it?" "Precisely," I confirmed. "If they knew the money came from me, pride would prevent them from accepting it. Claire's entire identity is wrapped up in the Harrington family's supposed wealth and status. Admitting they need my help would be impossible for her." Martin considered this, fingers steepled beneath his chin in the professorial manner he had never abandoned in retirement. "It's certainly possible to create an anonymous scholarship, but targeting it specifically to one student without raising suspicions? That requires some creative structuring." Over the next several weeks, Martin introduced me to specialists in education law, foundation governance, and financial planning. Together, we crafted a strategy that would accomplish my goals while remaining legally and ethically sound. The James Parker Education Foundation was established with an initial endowment of $2.5 million. Nearly two-thirds of my savings and investments, after selling some property James and I had purchased decades earlier as retirement insurance. The foundation's stated mission was supporting academically gifted students with financial need, with preference given to those interested in economics, education, or public service, areas that reflected James's values and, not coincidentally, aligned with Ethan's academic strengths. To avoid any appearance of impropriety, we established a selection committee comprised of respected educators with no connection to my family. Martin would serve as the foundation's public face, while I remained officially uninvolved beyond the initial endowment. The selection criteria were carefully calibrated to favor candidates with Ethan's specific profile without being so narrow as to raise suspicions. "This is a significant financial commitment, Eleanor," my financial advisor warned during one planning session. "Are you certain you want to allocate so much of your resources to this foundation? It will substantially change your retirement projections." "I'm certain," I replied without hesitation. What better use for this money than investing in my grandson's future and potentially other students like him? James would have wanted this. The foundation's first year would coincide with Ethan's college applications, allowing him to be among the inaugural scholarship recipients if he met the criteria. The timing was deliberate but not suspicious. Many families establish educational foundations when their grandchildren reach college age. With the legal and financial framework in place, we launched the foundation with a modest announcement in Chinese the Westfield College alumni newsletter and targeted outreach to high school guidance counselors throughout New England. The response was immediate and encouraging. Dozens of inquiries from qualified students with demonstrated financial need and impressive academic credentials. What I hadn't anticipated was how fulfilling this project would become beyond its original purpose. Reading applications from bright young people facing financial barriers to education reminded me powerfully of James's own journey from his working-class Pennsylvania background to academic distinction. Each essay reflected ambition, intelligence, and determination that transcended economic circumstance. As Ethan's high school graduation approached, I received no invitation to attend the ceremony. My only knowledge of this milestone came through Catherine, who had maintained occasional contact with Robert despite her disapproval of how I'd been treated. "Ethan's valedictorian," she reported during one of our weekly calls. "His speech apparently focuses on educational opportunity and economic inequality. Interesting topics given the Harrington family's fixation on wealth and status. He sounds like his grandfather," I observed, a bittersweet pride welling up. Though excluded from his life, I could see James's intellectual curiosity and social conscience emerging in our grandson despite Claire's efforts to direct him toward more materialistic values. The Foundation Selection Committee met in April to review applications and determine the inaugural scholarship recipients. As planned, I had no official role in this process, though Martin kept me discreetly informed. When the final selections were announced in May, Ethan Parker's name was among the 8 chosen students, each receiving 4-year scholarships covering full tuition at their selected institutions. I learned of Ethan's reaction secondhand through a chance encounter with a former colleague who knew Robert. "Your grandson received quite a prestigious scholarship," she mentioned during a community garden event. "The James Parker Education Foundation. Isn't that a remarkable coincidence? Same name as your late husband." "Yes, quite a coincidence," I agreed, maintaining the facade of disconnection we had so carefully constructed. "Robert seemed quite emotional about it," she continued. "Said something about it feeling like his father was still looking out for the family. Very touching." This indirect glimpse into my son's reaction brought unexpected tears to my eyes. The scholarship had achieved its practical purpose of ensuring Ethan's education, but I hadn't anticipated this emotional resonance, that Robert would feel his father's presence in this assistance arriving at their moment of need. That summer passed without direct contact from Robert or his family, though the foundation received a formally worded thank you letter from Ethan, expressing gratitude for the opportunity to attend Princeton University, coincidentally, James's alma mater. The letter mentioned his interest in economics and public policy, areas that would have delighted his grandfather. With Ethan's immediate educational future secured, I might have stepped back from active involvement with the foundation. Instead, I found myself increasingly engaged with its mission. The other 7 inaugural scholarship recipients, all exceptional students with significant financial need, had become important to me. Their thank you letters, progress reports, and occasional visits to the foundation office, where they met with Martin, not knowing my connection, gave me purpose and joy I hadn't experienced since James's passing. The foundation's second year brought increased visibility and a substantially larger applicant pool. With careful management and additional fundraising efforts led by Martin, we expanded to 12 scholarships annually. Each recipient's story touched me deeply. The daughter of immigrants working 3 jobs to support her family while maintaining a perfect GPA, the young man who had overcome homelessness to excel academically, the aspiring teacher from a rural community where no one had attended college for generations. Through these students, I remained connected to the values that had defined my life. With James, education is transformation, Knowledge is power, learning as the great equalizer across social divisions. Though established initially as a means to help my grandson, the foundation had evolved into something with broader significance, a living memorial to James's lifelong commitment to educational opportunity. During Ethan's sophomore year at Princeton, I received my first indirect communication from him since his scholarship acceptance. The foundation routinely requested progress updates from recipients, and Ethan's report included a personal note to the selection committee. The James Parker Scholarship has been transformative beyond covering tuition costs. Learning about Professor Parker's commitment to educational access has inspired my academic focus on economic inequality and education policy. Though I never met him, I feel a connection to his values and mission that has shaped my educational journey in unexpected ways. Martin shared this note during one of our private foundation meetings, watching my reaction carefully. He seems to be following in James's footsteps without even realizing the family connection, he observed. Nature or nurture? Perhaps intellectual passions run in the genes. Or perhaps, I suggested, blinking back tears, some values transcend, even deliberate separation. James would be so proud of the path he's choosing. The irony wasn't lost on me. Claire had systematically removed me from Ethan's life to prevent exactly this influence, this connection to the Parker family's academic values. Yet despite her efforts, Ethan was independently discovering and embracing these very priorities through a scholarship bearing his grandfather's name. By Ethan's junior year, news reached me through university circles that he had become something of a campus leader, founding a student organization focused on educational equity, interning with education policy researchers, and publishing articles in campus publications about economic barriers to higher education. Without knowing it, he was championing the very causes his grandfather had dedicated his career to advancing. It was during this period that an unexpected opportunity arose. Princeton was hosting a symposium on educational access featuring speakers from various foundations supporting this work. As the James Parker Education Foundation had gained recognition in this field, Martin was invited to participate. He approached me with characteristic directness. Eleanor, this presents an interesting dilemma. The foundation should be represented at this event, but I have a scheduling conflict with my daughter's wedding. Would you consider attending in my place? It would mean potentially encountering Ethan on campus. The proposition both terrified and tempted me. For years, I had maintained careful distance to preserve the scholarship's anonymity. Yet the possibility of seeing my grandson, even from afar, was powerfully alluring. I would attend as a foundation representative, not as his grandmother, I reasoned aloud. There's no reason he would make the connection after all this time. Martin nodded. That's true, though I should mention he's listed among the student panelists discussing scholarship impact. You might be in the same room, possibly even introduced. My heart raced at the prospect. I'll go, I decided. After all this time operating in the shadows, perhaps seeing him, seeing the man he's becoming, would provide some closure. The symposium was scheduled for October, when the Princeton campus would be ablaze with autumn colors. I prepared meticulously, reviewing foundation documents, practicing answers to potential questions, selecting a professional outfit that looked nothing like the casual grandmother wear Ethan might vaguely remember from childhood. The campus exceeded even my expectations, its Gothic buildings and tree-lined walks creating a perfect academic tableau. The symposium was held in a modern conference center at the university's edge, filled with foundation representatives, education researchers, university administrators, and selected students. I took a seat in the rear of the auditorium for the opening presentations, scanning the room for any sign of Ethan. I spotted him immediately. Tall like his grandfather, with James's distinctive jawline and thoughtful expression. At 20, he had matured into a poised young man who moved with quiet confidence through the pre-symposium networking. Watching him from across the room, I felt a complex surge of emotions, pride in the adult he was becoming, grief for the years of connection we had lost, and a bittersweet satisfaction that despite everything, James's values lived on in our grandson. The student panel was scheduled after lunch. I listened with growing emotion as each scholarship recipient, Ethan included, discussed how educational funding had transformed their opportunities and aspirations. When Ethan's turn came, he spoke with a passion and clarity that could have been James's voice 30 years earlier. The James Parker Scholarship didn't just finance my education, he explained to the audience. It connected me to a legacy of educational values that resonated deeply with interests I was already developing. Learning about Professor Parker's commitment to educational equity helped me understand my own priorities more clearly. Though I never had the opportunity to meet him, his values have become a guiding influence in my academic journey. I pressed a tissue to my eyes, overwhelmed by the irony. Ethan believed he had never met the professor whose name graced his scholarship, unaware that he was speaking about his own grandfather, whose knee he had once sat on while being read, bedtime stories about curious monkeys and wild things. After the panel concluded, attendees mingled during a coffee break. I stood near the refreshment table, debating whether to introduce myself to Ethan in my capacity as a foundation representative. Before I could decide, he approached on his own initiative. "Excuse me," he said politely. "Are you with the James Parker Education Foundation? I recognize the pin on your lapel." He gestured toward the small gold emblem bearing the foundation's logo that all board members wore. "Yes," I replied, fighting to keep my voice steady. "I work with the foundation. Your panel presentation was excellent." "Thank you," he smiled. James's smile, I noted with a pang. "The foundation has been tremendously important to me. Would you mind if I asked a few questions about Professor Parker? The foundation materials include his basic biography, but I've always been curious about the person behind the formal accomplishments." The moment stretched into surreal territory. My grandson asking me about his grandfather, neither of us acknowledging our actual relationship. For a brief, wild moment, I considered revealing everything: the estrangement, the scholarship's true origin, our family connection. Instead, I adhered to the role I had committed to playing. "Professor Parker was a remarkable educator," I began, speaking about my husband as if he were merely a respected colleague. He believed deeply that education could transform lives regardless of economic background. He was brilliant but unpretentious, demanding but deeply supportive of students committed to learning. "That aligns with everything I've read," Ethan nodded. "Was the foundation established by his family after his passing?" Another moment of exquisite tension. "By those who valued his educational philosophy," I replied carefully. "The foundation continues his commitment to making quality education accessible to deserving students." Our conversation continued for several minutes, this extraordinary artificial exchange where neither of us acknowledged the profound connection between us. As we parted, Ethan extended his hand formally. "Thank you for your time and for the foundation's support. Professor Parker's legacy is making a real difference for students like me." I shook his hand, feeling the weight of unspoken truths between us. "That's precisely what the foundation hopes to accomplish. Professor Parker would be very proud of how you're using this opportunity." The encounter left me emotionally drained, but curiously fulfilled. I had seen firsthand the remarkable young man Ethan was becoming. Thoughtful, articulate, committed to values that James and I had championed throughout our lives. Though excluded from his upbringing, I had found a way to influence his future positively, without the conflict that direct involvement would have triggered. As Ethan's senior year progressed, Martin kept me updated on his accomplishments. Departmental honors, acceptance to Princeton's public policy graduate program, and selection for prestigious research positions. The foundation had already committed to supporting his graduate education, ensuring continuity in his academic journey. What I couldn't have anticipated was the dramatic shift in family circumstances that would occur shortly before Ethan's graduation. Catherine called one February evening, her voice tense with urgency. "Mom, have you heard from Robert? He's trying to reach you." "Robert?" I echoed in surprise. Direct communication from my son had become so rare that the prospect seemed almost foreign. "No, I haven't heard anything. What's happening?" Claire's father passed away suddenly. Heart attack. The family's financial situation is even worse than we realized. With his death, all the carefully maintained illusions have collapsed. Robert finally told Claire about your foundation's support of Ethan. Apparently, there was quite a scene. My heart sank at the thought of their distress, despite the years of exclusion. "Should I call him?" "He's going to call you," Catherine replied. "I think they're finally ready to acknowledge they need help, and that they've treated you terribly. All these years." Robert's call came the following morning. The first direct, extended conversation we'd had in nearly 3 years. His voice sounded strained, exhausted. "Mom, I owe you an apology," he began without preamble. "Multiple apologies, actually. For allowing Claire to dictate our family relationships. For excluding you from Ethan's life. And for not acknowledging that we've been accepting your financial support through the foundation for years." "You knew?" I asked, genuinely surprised. "About my involvement with the foundation?" "Not until recently," he admitted. "Martin finally told me when I approached him about additional scholarship options for Ethan's graduate studies. He felt it was time for the truth to come out." The conversation that followed was painful but necessary. Robert acknowledging the pretense his family had maintained as their financial situation deteriorated. His growing recognition of Claire's manipulation, and his deep regret for allowing my relationship with Ethan to be severed. "Claire's father's death has forced a lot of reality to the surface," he explained. "The investment firm is essentially bankrupt. Their house is being foreclosed upon. Claire's having to confront that the wealth and status she built her identity around was mostly smoke and mirrors toward the end. I'm sorry for their losses," I said sincerely. "Despite everything, I took no pleasure in their hardship." "The thing is, Mom," Robert continued hesitantly, "Ethan's graduation is in May. I would like you to be there, as his grandmother, not just as a foundation representative. He deserves to know the truth about who's really been supporting his education all these years." The invitation to Ethan's graduation, this milestone I had assumed I would experience, only through secondhand reports, left me momentarily speechless. "Are you certain? What about Claire?" "Claire's perspective has evolved," Robert said carefully. "Losing her father, facing financial reality, it's been humbling. She's realized that the values she dismissed, education, intellectual integrity, genuine scholarship, are exactly what's giving Ethan stability through all this family turmoil." The weeks leading up to graduation brought tentative steps toward family reconciliation. Claire called personally to extend the graduation invitation, her customary polish replaced by subdued sincerity. "Eleanor, we've treated you unconscionably," she said without attempting to soften the truth. "I allowed pride and superficial values to deprive Ethan of a relationship with his grandmother, and to reject the very educational priorities that have ultimately given him his greatest opportunities. I don't expect immediate forgiveness, but I hope we can begin rebuilding some connection." Ethan himself remained unaware of both the family's financial reality and my role in his education. Robert and Claire had decided, with my agreement, that the full story would be shared after his graduation ceremony, a day that should remain uncomplicated by family revelations. Princeton's campus was resplendent in early May, historic buildings, adorned with orange and black banners, generations of families gathering to celebrate their graduates' achievements. I took my seat in the designated family section, emotion threatening to overwhelm me as I prepared to witness this milestone I had thought forever denied to me. Robert, Claire, and Claire's mother, Margaret, joined me shortly before the ceremony. began. Our greeting was awkward but cordial, the first time in years we had appeared together as a family unit. Claire looked noticeably different, her designer clothes replaced by a simple dress, her normally perfect appearance showing signs of recent stress and grief. "Thank you for coming, Eleanor," she said quietly. "And for everything else. I'm only beginning to understand the magnitude of your generosity, not just financial, but spiritual. To support Ethan so completely despite how we've treated you." The ceremony itself was everything one would expect from a prestigious university. Pomp, distinguished speakers, and the visible pride of accomplishment among the graduates. When Ethan's name was called, accompanied by notations of his academic honors and selection as a James Parker Foundation scholar, I applauded with undisguised pride, tears streaming freely. This moment, watching my grandson cross the stage in his academic regalia, embodying the educational values James and I had championed throughout our lives, felt like closure of a painful chapter and the opening of a new one filled with possibility. The planned family dinner following graduation would be the setting for revelations, both about the family's financial situation and my role in establishing the scholarship that had supported Ethan's education. As we gathered at a restaurant near campus, I felt a curious calm despite the emotional magnitude of what was to come. Ethan arrived last, still in his graduation robe, face flushed with accomplishment and celebration. He embraced his parents and grandmother Margaret before turning to me with more formal politeness. "I'm so glad you could join us, Mrs. Parker," he said, clearly recognizing me from the Foundation Symposium but unaware of our true connection. "Dad mentioned you've been involved with the foundation that provided my scholarship." "Actually, Ethan," Robert interjected gently, "there's something important we need to discuss about the foundation, and about Grandma Eleanor's role in your life." What followed was a carefully orchestrated explanation, Robert acknowledging the family's financial collapse and the deliberate estrangement that had kept me at a distance for most of Ethan's childhood. Claire admitted her role in this separation, her voice breaking as she described how pride and superficial values had driven destructive family decisions. Ethan listened with growing confusion, glancing between his parents and me as the story unfolded. The revelatory moment came when Robert explained the origin of the James Parker Education Foundation. "The scholarship that funded your education didn't come from some distant charitable organization, Ethan. It came from your grandmother. She established the entire foundation specifically to ensure you could attend college without financial barriers, while knowing that our family situation made it impossible for us to accept direct help. Your grandfather James was my husband," I added softly, seeing recognition dawn in his eyes. "The professor whose educational philosophy you found so inspiring was your own grandfather. The foundation was my way of keeping his values alive in your life when I couldn't be present myself." Ethan sat in stunned silence, processing this revelation. "All this time," he finally said, "I've been studying educational equity and economic opportunity, the very values my grandfather championed, without realizing he was my actual grandfather? And you created an entire foundation to support my education anonymously because Mom and Dad had shut you out of my life?" The stark truth, laid bare in his summarization, hung in the air between us. "I didn't know," he continued, turning to his parents with quiet intensity. "I never understood why we rarely saw Grandma Eleanor. I just assumed there was some adult disagreement, the way families sometimes have. I never imagined it was a deliberate separation, or that she would respond to that exclusion with such extraordinary generosity." Claire looked down at her plate, unable to meet her son's gaze. "We made terrible mistakes, Ethan. Choices based on appearances and status rather than what truly matters. Your grandmother found a way to support you despite our behavior. Something I'm only beginning to understand the magnitude of." Ethan turned to me, his expression a complex mixture of emotion. "The foundation doesn't just support me, though. There are 11 other scholars currently receiving funding. I nodded. What began as a way to ensure your education evolved into something larger. Each application we received represented a student with tremendous potential facing financial barriers. How could I not expand the mission when the means were available? Your grandfather would have wanted that legacy. So the stories I've been researching about Professor Parker and his work with first-generation college students were about your grandfather, I confirmed. The values you've independently embraced are part of your heritage, even when we weren't allowed to share that directly with you. The evening continued with questions, explanations, apologies, and the tentative foundation of renewed family connections. Ethan moved between shock, understanding, and a growing appreciation for the complex circumstances that had shaped his educational journey. As dinner concluded, he asked if I would walk with him around campus, a request that brought immediate tears to my eyes. As we strolled past historic buildings in the gathering twilight, Ethan spoke with the thoughtful candor that reminded me so powerfully of James. I've spent the past 4 years immersed in research about educational opportunity and economic mobility, he said. I've written papers about how education can transform family trajectories across generations. And all along, I was living that very story without realizing it. Your grandfather believed education was the most profound form of inheritance, more valuable than money or property, because it creates capability that can never be taken away, I replied. Seeing you embrace those values independently, without direct influence, has been the greatest validation of that belief. What happens now? He asked, stopping beside Firestone Library where, coincidentally, James had spent countless hours during his own student days. With our family, I mean. Can we rebuild what was lost? I considered the question carefully. We can build something new, I offered. Relationships based on authentic values rather than appearances. Connections that honor your grandfather's legacy while creating our own. It won't replace the years we lost, but it can create something meaningful moving forward. Ethan nodded, his expression reflective in the campus lamplight. The foundation. Will you continue it? Beyond my graduate education? Absolutely, I assured him. The James Parker Education Foundation has evolved beyond its initial purpose. Those 12 scholarships annually represent 12 lives transformed through educational opportunity. Exactly what your grandfather dedicated his career to promoting. I'd like to be involved, he said with sudden decision. Not just as a recipient, but as a contributor to its mission. My graduate work in education policy aligns perfectly with the Foundation's goals. This unexpected proposition, my grandson, actively engaging with the Foundation originally created to support him anonymously, felt like the completion of a circle. What began as a response to exclusion had evolved into a vehicle for reconnection, now potentially becoming a shared family mission bridging 3 generations. As we completed our campus walk and prepared to rejoin the family, Ethan stopped and turned to me. Grandma, he said, the first time he had used that title with me since early childhood. Thank you. Not just for the scholarship, but for finding a way to influence my life positively when direct connection wasn't possible. That kind of creative generosity is something I want to understand and hopefully embody in my own work. The graduation weekend concluded with tentative plans for family reconnection. Ethan would visit Westfield during the summer break before beginning graduate studies. Robert and Claire would join for part of that visit, and we would discuss potential collaboration on expanding the Foundation's mission. As I drove back to Westfield alone, I reflected on the extraordinary journey from exclusion to reconciliation. The anonymous scholarship that began as a way to support my grandson's education, despite family estrangement, had evolved into something neither I nor James could have imagined. A living legacy that had already transformed multiple lives and would continue doing so for generations. The painful years of separation could never be erased, but they had been transformed into something unexpectedly meaningful. By responding to rejection with anonymous generosity rather than resentment, I had created a path back to family connection that honored James's values while creating new possibilities for healing and purpose. My grandson's graduation, an event I had once assumed would be experienced only through distant reports, had become instead the beginning of a new chapter for our family. Not a return to what was lost, but the creation of something potentially more authentic and meaningful than what had existed before. As I arrived home and placed Ethan's graduation program on James's desk, I felt my late husband's presence more strongly than at any time since his passing. "He found his way to your values despite everything," I whispered to the empty study. "And in trying to keep your educational legacy alive for him, I've created something that will extend that mission far beyond what either of us imagined." The path from exclusion to reconciliation had been neither direct nor easy. But in responding to rejection with anonymous generosity rather than bitterness, I had discovered that sometimes the most powerful presence is the one that operates unseen, until exactly the right moment for revelation. The summer following Ethan's graduation unfolded in ways I could never have anticipated. After years of estrangement, my home was once again filled with family, tentative at first, then with growing comfort as we navigated this new chapter in our relationships. Ethan arrived first, spending 2 weeks in Westfield before Robert and Claire joined us for a long weekend that stretched into a week of reconciliation and recalibration. Those initial days alone with my grandson were precious beyond measure. We walked the Westfield College campus together, retracing paths James had traveled daily during his teaching career. I showed Ethan his grandfather's former office in Thompson Hall, now occupied by a young economics professor who graciously welcomed us, intrigued by the family connection to his distinguished predecessor. "Professor Parker's theories on educational access are still part of our curriculum," she told Ethan, gesturing to a shelf containing several academic journals with James's articles. His work on economic mobility through higher education was ahead of its time. Ethan's expression, a mixture of pride and wistful regret for the relationship he'd never had, touched me deeply. Later, as we walked beneath the ancient elms lining the academic quad, he voiced the question that clearly troubled him. How much did I miss by not knowing him, by not understanding my connection to this place and these ideas? "You found your way to his values anyway," I reminded him gently. "Perhaps that's the most powerful testament to their truth, that without direct influence, you independently embraced the same principles that guided his life." Beyond campus explorations, we spent hours in James's study, where I'd preserved his books and papers exactly as he'd left them. Ethan pored over his grandfather's handwritten lecture notes, published articles, and the personal journals detailing his thoughts on education, economics, and social responsibility. "His writing voice is so familiar," Ethan observed one evening, looking up from a journal dating from the 1990s. Some of these passages could have come directly from my own research papers. It's almost uncanny. "Intellectual DNA," I suggested with a smile. "Some perspectives are perhaps passed down as surely as eye color or height. The most meaningful moments came through stories, my recollections of James as a husband, father, and educator, shared over tea in the garden or during evening walks around Westfield's historic town square. Ethan absorbed these narratives with quiet intensity, occasionally asking questions that revealed his desire to construct a complete picture of the grandfather he'd barely known. "Was he always certain about his path?" Ethan asked one evening. "Did he ever doubt his choice of academia over more lucrative options?" "Many times," I admitted. "Especially when you father was young and we struggled with typical faculty financial constraints. But James believed work should serve something beyond material acquisition. We're comfortable enough," he would say. "Anything more would be excess, at the expense of purpose." These conversations created bridges across the years of separation, not erasing them, but constructing new connections that acknowledge the past while looking toward the future. Through Ethan's thoughtful questions and genuine interest in his grandfather's legacy, I began to feel James's presence more vividly than I had since his passing, as if by sharing these memories, we were collectively keeping his spirit alive in new ways. When Robert and Claire arrived, the dynamic shifted. Tentative, awkward at first, weighted with unspoken apologies and lingering hurt. Claire appeared dramatically transformed from the polished, status-conscious woman who had systematically excluded me from family gatherings. Financial collapse and her father's death had stripped away the carefully maintained facade, revealing a vulnerability I'd never witnessed in her before. Our first evening together, after Ethan had gone to meet childhood friends for coffee, Claire asked to speak with me privately. We sat in the back garden where James had once tended heritage roses with scholarly precision, the same garden where Robert had played as a child and where family celebrations had unfolded before the estrangement. I don't know how to adequately apologize, Claire began, her composed demeanor briefly faltering. What I did, separating you from Ethan, rejecting the values that would have enriched his life, pretending to a status and security that was increasingly hollow. There's no justification I can offer that wouldn't sound like an excuse. Why did it happen? I asked simply. After years of hurt, I deserved at least understanding, if not complete reconciliation. Claire was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with unexpected depth. I grew up defined by the Harrington name, by wealth and position that seemed immutable. My father measured everyone, including his children, by their contribution to family prestige. When I married Robert, my parents viewed his academic career as charming but fundamentally unserious, something I would elevate through my connections. She continued, her gaze fixed on the garden's central fountain rather than meeting my eyes directly. When Ethan was born, I felt this overwhelming pressure to ensure he followed the right path, the Harrington path of connections, prestigious institutions, and eventually, financial success. Your influence, your and James' commitment to education for its own sake, to intellectual integrity over material acquisition, threatened that narrative. Values aren't contagious diseases, Claire, I observed quietly. Exposure to different perspectives enriches rather than contaminates. I know that now, she acknowledged. The irony is excruciating, that in trying to push Ethan toward what I thought was success, I nearly deprived him of the very foundation that has ultimately sustained him through our family's collapse. While the Harrington empire crumbled, the Parker educational legacy provided stability and purpose beyond anything money could secure. Her insight, though belated, seemed genuine. The transformation wasn't just external, the designer clothes, replaced by simpler attire, the perfect manicure now absent, but reflected a fundamental reevaluation of priorities forced by circumstances she had never anticipated. What happens now? I asked, echoing the question Ethan had posed during our campus walk. We rebuild, Claire replied with unexpected directness. I'm selling my mother's jewelry to cover immediate expenses. Robert has taken a teaching position at a community college since his department was eliminated. We've moved from our house to a faculty apartment on campus. Everything has changed. The details of their financial collapse emerged gradually over the following days. Gregory Harrington's increasingly risky investments as the firm faced mounting challenges, the facade of prosperity maintained through escalating debt, and finally, the complete unraveling following his death when creditors demanded immediate payment from an estate, consisting primarily of leveraged assets and unpaid tax obligations. We didn't tell Ethan the full extent until after his graduation, Robert explained during a private conversation in James's study. He knew things were difficult, that's why he applied for scholarships, but not that we were essentially bankrupt. Why maintain the pretense? I asked, especially when help was available. Robert's expression reflected decades of complex family dynamics. Claire's identity was completely entwined with the Harrington wealth and status. Admitting financial failure meant confronting not just practical challenges, but a fundamental questioning of who she was and what her family represented. And now? Now she's discovering who she is without those external markers, he said thoughtfully. It's painful, but potentially transformative. The woman who emerges from this crisis might be more authentic than the one I've been married to for 25 years. This family reconciliation unfolded against the backdrop of foundation work that had come to define my purpose. Throughout Ethan's visit, I included him in aspects of the James Parker Education Foundation's operations, reviewing applications for the upcoming academic year, corresponding with current scholars about their progress, and discussing potential expansion of the program. His perspective proved invaluable, particularly regarding the scholarship application process. The essay questions focused primarily on academic achievements, he observed after reviewing the materials. But what about assessing persistence, adaptability, and purpose? Those qualities matter more than perfect grades for long-term success. This insight led to a significant redesign of the application, incorporating questions about challenges overcome and commitment to educational values beyond credential acquisition. Ethan's contribution reflected James's approach to student assessment, looking beyond conventional metrics to identify genuine intellectual passion and resilience. During the final evening before Robert and Claire's departure, as we shared dinner, on the back patio, Ethan raised the topic that had been implicit in many of our conversations that week. "I've been thinking about the Foundation's future," he began, glancing between his parents and me, "about how to expand its impact while preserving Grandpa James's core values." The proposal he outlined revealed both careful thought and genuine commitment, a plan to integrate his graduate research on educational policy with the Foundation's practical work supporting deserving students. He envisioned creating a research component documenting the impact of scholarships on recipients' lives and leveraging those findings to advocate for broader educational access. The Foundation currently helps 12 students annually, he explained, his expression reflecting James's intensity when presenting important ideas. That's significant, but what if we could use those success stories to influence institutional policies affecting thousands? What if the James Parker Education Foundation became not just a scholarship provider, but a catalyst for systemic change? The ambition and scope of his vision momentarily took my breath away. Not just its intellectual merit, but what it represented relationally. After years of Claire's calculated separation, Ethan was proposing to integrate his professional future with his grandfather's legacy and my current work. The estrangement hadn't just ended, it had transformed into active collaboration across 3 generations. That would require significant expansion, I noted, thinking through practical implications. Additional fundraising, staffing, research protocols? I've thought about that, Ethan nodded. My graduate program includes nonprofit management coursework. What if my practicum focused on developing this expansion? I could split time between Princeton and Westfield, implementing the research component while learning the operational aspects of foundation management. Claire, who had been listening quietly, spoke up with unexpected support. It's perfect, actually. Combining academic research with practical impact, exactly what education should accomplish. This endorsement, from the woman who had once dismissed James's academic career as financially impractical and deliberately separated Ethan from his educational values, marked perhaps the most profound transformation of our reconciliation process. As Robert and Claire prepared to leave the following morning, Claire asked for a moment alone with me. In the front hallway, surrounded by family photographs that chronicled decades before the estrangement, she spoke with uncharacteristic humility. "I want you to know that I understand the magnitude of what you did," she said quietly. "When our family was collapsing, when my family's financial house of cards was falling, you ensured Ethan's education continued uninterrupted. You responded to years of exclusion with extraordinary generosity. That kind of grace is instructive. The acknowledgement wasn't overly emotional or dramatic. That wouldn't have been authentic to Claire's reserved nature, but its sincerity was unmistakable. We wouldn't become close friends or confidants. Too much history stood between us. But we had established a foundation for a different relationship moving forward, one based on mutual respect for our respective roles in Ethan's life, rather than competition or exclusion. After they departed, Ethan remained for another week, dividing his time between foundation work and deeper exploration of his grandfather's academic papers. Together, we developed a framework for integrating his graduate studies with the Foundation's mission, a formal practicum arrangement with his Princeton department that would allow him to split time between campus and Westfield while earning academic credit for his foundation work. "This feels right," he told me our final evening together, as we walked through Westfield's historic district toward the small lake where James and I had often ended our own evening strolls. Like pieces, falling into place that should have been connected all along. "Your grandfather believed everyone's path unfolds according to its own timing," I replied. "Some connections have to be discovered rather than inherited. Still, I can't help wondering how different things might have been if I'd known him. Known you throughout my childhood. All those Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings that might have happened." The wistfulness in his voice echoed my own lingering sadness for what had been lost. "We can't reclaim those years," I acknowledged. "But perhaps their absence makes what we're building now more intentional, more deeply valued, because we understand its significance." Ethan nodded, his expression thoughtful in the gathering twilight. "I've been reading Grandpa's journals from when Dad was growing up. The entries about educational philosophy, about creating family culture around intellectual curiosity. They're exactly what I want to incorporate if I ever have children someday. Like receiving delayed wisdom that skipped a generation. This perspective, finding value in our belated connection rather than dwelling exclusively on what had been lost, reflected maturity beyond his years and offered a healing framework for moving forward. We couldn't erase the separation that had characterized most of his childhood, but we could create meaning from our current relationship that honored both the past and future. The practical implementation of our plans began that fall. Ethan started his graduate program at Princeton while establishing a regular schedule of extended weekends in Westfield, working with the foundation. We converted the sunroom into a research office, installing modern technology within the historic home's gracious architecture, a physical manifestation of bridging generations and approaches. Our collaboration quickly proved remarkably productive. Ethan's academic training brought contemporary research methodologies and data analysis to the Foundation's work, while my decades of experience with educational institutions provided practical wisdom and established connections. Together, we developed a comprehensive study tracking the long-term impact of scholarships on recipients' educational trajectories, career choices, and eventual community contributions. By December, we had created a preliminary research protocol and reached out to all previous James Parker scholars, 47 students whose education the Foundation had supported over its existence. The response was overwhelming. Nearly every recipient eager to participate in documenting their experiences and contributing to research that might expand similar opportunities for future students. Their stories proved even more compelling than we had anticipated. Beyond academic and career achievements, many scholars described profound ripple effects within their families and communities. Younger siblings inspired to pursue higher education, mentorship programs established in home communities, and professional choices influenced by desires to pay forward the opportunities they had received. Jasmine Martinez, one of the Foundation's first scholars now working as a pediatrician in an underserved rural community, wrote, "The James Parker Scholarship didn't just finance my education, it transformed my understanding of possibility. Now my younger brother and 3 cousins have completed college, the first in our extended family, creating an intergenerational educational momentum that changes everything." These narratives became the foundation for an expanding vision. Comprehensive report documenting how targeted educational support could transform not just individual lives, but entire family and community trajectories. By spring, Ethan had developed this research into his graduate thesis, while simultaneously implementing its findings into the Foundation's strategic planning. "We need to think beyond individual scholarships," he explained during a Foundation board meeting where Martin continued as chairman while I maintained my officially unofficial role. "The data suggests clustered impact is more transformative. Supporting multiple students from the same underserved communities creates mentorship networks and visible success models that amplify individual outcomes." This insight led to a significant programmatic expansion, the Community Scholars Initiative that would identify promising students from specific under-resourced areas and provide not just financial support but mentorship connections with previous scholars from similar backgrounds. The approach required additional funding, which led to our next evolution. In March, an unexpected opportunity arose when Westfield College announced plans for a major capital campaign focused on educational access and equity. The college president, Dr. Abigail Washington, reached out specifically about potential collaboration with the James Parker Education Foundation, having noted both our local impact and the promising research Ethan was developing. "Professor Parker's legacy aligns perfectly with our institutional priority of expanding educational opportunity," she explained during our initial meeting. "We're hoping the foundation might consider a formal partnership that would amplify both our efforts." The resulting collaboration exceeded all expectations. Westfield College provided institutional infrastructure and matching funds, while the foundation contributed its scholarship model, research findings, and community connections. By summer, the James Parker Center for Educational Access had been established on campus, a physical space housing both the expanded foundation operations and new college initiatives focused on first-generation and underrepresented students. Ethan's role evolved accordingly. What began as a graduate practicum developed into a formal research fellowship, jointly funded by Princeton and Westfield College, allowing him to divide his time between institutions while completing his doctoral work on educational access models. The arrangement perfectly bridged his academic training with practical implementation, exactly the integration of theory and application that James had always advocated. 2 years after Ethan's graduation revelation, the James Parker Education Foundation had transformed from a modest scholarship program supporting 12 students annually to a comprehensive educational access initiative with multiple components. The original scholarship program, now expanded to 20 students annually. The Community Scholars Initiative, working intensively with 3 underserved regional communities. The Research and Policy Division, developing evidence-based advocacy for institutional change. The Mentorship Network, connecting current scholars with program alumni. The Faculty Engagement Program, involving Westfield professors in supporting first-generation students. This expansion required significant additional funding beyond my initial endowment. Here, too, unexpected developments created new possibilities. Claire, drawing on her art world connections and emerging from her family's financial collapse with renewed purpose, proved remarkably effective at fundraising. Her understanding of philanthropic networks, combined with genuine conviction about educational access that would have been unimaginable during our years of estrangement, brought new donors and institutional partners to the foundation. "The irony isn't lost on me," she acknowledged during one planning meeting, "that I'm now leveraging the social connections I once valued for entirely different purposes than I would have imagined." Robert, too, found meaningful involvement despite the career upheaval following his university department's elimination. His community college teaching position, initially accepted out of financial necessity, evolved into a passionate commitment to supporting non-traditional students. This experience informed the Foundation's expanding focus on educational pathways beyond traditional 4-year institutions. The most meaningful development, however, came through my relationship with Ethan. No longer defined by absence and exclusion, but by shared purpose and deepening connection. Our weekly collaboration on foundation work provided natural opportunities for the personal relationship that had been denied during his childhood. Conversations that began with scholarship selection criteria often evolved into discussions of values, purpose, and legacy that transcended operational details. During one such conversation in the Foundation's new campus office, surrounded by photographs of James Parker scholars and framed copies of James's most significant academic publications, Ethan raised a question that revealed how deeply he had integrated his grandfather's legacy into his own developing identity. "Do you think Grandpa would see this work as effectively advancing his values? Or would he have approached things differently?" I considered the question carefully, appreciating its reflection of genuine desire to honor James's principles rather than perfunctory sentiment. "He would recognize his core values in everything we're doing," I responded. "The commitment to educational opportunity, the belief in knowledge as transformative, the integration of research with practical impact, these were his guiding principles. But he would also expect evolution rather than simple replication." "Evolution? How?" Ethan pressed. "James believed that effective ideas must adapt to changing contexts while maintaining their essential integrity," I explained. "He would want us to respond to contemporary challenges using his values as foundation rather than fixed formula. I think he would be deeply gratified to see you bringing current research methodologies and fresh perspective to these enduring principles." This blend of honoring legacy while encouraging innovation became the hallmark of our Foundation's approach, respecting James's educational philosophy while actively developing new applications relevant to current educational challenges. The result wasn't preservation of the past, but productive dialogue between generations that created something neither could have accomplished alone. By the third anniversary of Ethan's graduation and our family reconciliation, the James Parker Education Foundation had achieved recognition extending far beyond our initial expectations. The research Ethan had developed through his graduate work had been published in leading educational policy journals. The Community Scholars Program had demonstrated measurable impact in its target communities, and the Foundation's model was being studied by similar initiatives across the country. Most significantly, what had begun as a private response to family estrangement had evolved into a public good, with impact extending far beyond our immediate circumstances. The anonymous scholarship established to ensure my grandson's education, despite family conflict, had generated a ripple effect influencing dozens of students directly and potentially thousands indirectly through institutional policy changes informed by our research. This expanded impact became powerfully evident during the Foundation's annual celebration event, now hosted on Westfield's campus with current and former scholars, faculty partners, and community representatives in attendance. As I watched Ethan deliver the keynote address, articulating a vision for educational access that seamlessly integrated his grandfather's values with contemporary research and his own developing perspective, I felt James's presence with remarkable clarity. "Education creates possibility beyond circumstance," Ethan told the audience, unconsciously echoing words James had written decades earlier in an academic paper few present would have read. "When we remove financial barriers to learning, we don't just benefit individual students. We transform family trajectories, community expectations, and ultimately, broader social structures that perpetuate inequity." His presentation included data from the Foundation's research documenting these transformative effects. Siblings inspired to pursue education after seeing their family members' success, community mentorship networks developing organically among scholarship recipients, and institutional policies changed through evidence-based advocacy. The statistics and case studies gave contemporary validation to principles James had championed throughout his academic career. Following the formal program, as attendees mingled during the reception, I found myself surrounded by James Parker, scholars from various years, some still completing their education, others established in careers ranging from medicine and law to education and social work. Their gratitude, while deeply moving, felt somehow secondary to the evident impact of educational opportunity in their lives and subsequent choices. Monica Jenkins, a current medical student and one of our first community scholars, approached, with characteristic directness. "Ms. Parker, I wanted you to know that I'm organizing a mentorship program in my hometown. 6 of us who received foundation scholarships are working with high school students, helping with applications and showing them that college is possible regardless of financial circumstances." "That's wonderful, Monica," I responded, genuinely moved by this organic extension of the Foundation's mission. "It was something Professor Parker wrote that inspired it," she continued, referring to one of James's articles we had included in materials shared with scholars, about how educational opportunity creates responsibility to extend that opportunity to others. I never met him, but his perspective has shaped how I think about my own education and its purpose. This comment, a young woman acknowledging influence, from a professor who had died before she was born, highlighted the unique power of values transmitted across generations. James's perspective, preserved through his writing and integrated into the Foundation's philosophy, continued shaping young lives decades after his passing. Later that evening, as Ethan and I walked home across campus beneath the same ancient elms that had witnessed James's academic career, I shared Monica's comment and its significance to me. "It's strange to think about, isn't it?" Ethan reflected. "How ideas outlive us, continuing to influence people who never knew us personally. Grandpa's values keep expanding outward through all these scholars, then through their influence on others. Your grandfather believed that was the most meaningful form of immortality," I told him. "Not monuments or buildings named after you, but ideas that continue evolving through others' minds and actions." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about that in relation to my own work. The dissertation I'm completing, the research models we're developing through the Foundation, they're not just academic exercises but potential contributions to this ongoing conversation about educational opportunity." "Exactly what James would have hoped for," I affirmed. "Not replication of his specific approaches, but evolution of core principles through new insights and applications." As we reached my home, still filled with James's books, now joined by Ethan's research materials during his frequent extended stays, I found myself reflecting on the extraordinary journey from rejection to reconciliation to collaborative purpose. What began as a hidden response to family estrangement had evolved into multi-generational commitment to values transcending our particular circumstances. The anonymous scholarship established when I wasn't invited to my grandson's high school. Activities had grown into a shared mission that now involved not just Ethan but Robert and even Claire in various capacities. The Foundation, created to ensure one student's education, despite family conflict, now supported dozens directly while advocating for systemic changes benefiting thousands more. Most significantly, the values James and I had cherished throughout our lives, education as transformation, knowledge as empowerment, learning as social responsibility, now continued through our grandson's work and the expanding influence of the Foundation bearing James's name. What might have ended with our generation now extended forward with renewed vigor and contemporary relevance. At 78, I could look back on the painful years of exclusion with something approaching gratitude for the unexpected gifts they had ultimately yielded. The estrangement that once seemed solely destructive had, through choices made in response to that pain, created opportunities for meaningful legacy I could never have anticipated. Being uninvited from my grandson's life had led, through circuitous and occasionally painful paths, to a relationship with him now based on deeper connection than might have developed through routine family interaction. Our shared work with the Foundation provided context for genuine collaboration across generations, not perfunctory holiday gatherings, but substantive engagement with values and purpose that mattered to us both. The Foundation itself had evolved, from personal response to family exclusion into independent entity with significance extending far beyond our particular circumstances. The scholars supported, communities engaged, and institutional practices influenced would continue generating impact long after my lifetime. A living legacy that would evolve rather than diminish with passing years. As Ethan and I settled in the living room with evening tea, a ritual developed during his extended visits that echoed similar evenings with James decades earlier, he raised the question that perhaps best captured our shared journey. Do you ever think about what would have happened if Mom hadn't excluded you back then? If there hadn't been that Thanksgiving argument and everything that followed? Often, I admitted, but with less regret than you might imagine. Why is that? Because while those years of separation were deeply painful, the response they prompted created something more meaningful than might otherwise have existed. The foundation, your connection to your grandfather's values, our work together now, all emerged from choices made in response to circumstances that seemed entirely negative at the time. Ethan considered this perspective carefully. So you're saying, sometimes the worst experiences create unexpected possibilities? Not automatically, I clarified. It depends entirely on how we respond to them. Your grandfather often quoted Viktor Frankl in his classes, that between stimulus and response lies our freedom to choose. The estrangement was the stimulus. The foundation was my chosen response. The outcome depended on that choice, not the initial circumstances. This perspective, finding meaning through chosen response to difficult circumstances rather than being defined by those circumstances themselves, reflected core values James and I had shared throughout our marriage. Seeing Ethan grasp and extend this understanding into his own work and life choices represented perhaps the most meaningful form of intergenerational connection. Not just shared DNA, but shared approach to finding purpose through deliberate engagement with life's challenges, Our evening conversation continued, touching on foundation developments, Ethan's dissertation progress, and plans for expanding the Community Scholars Program. I felt profound gratitude for the unexpected path that had led us here. The estrangement that once seemed an unmitigated loss had ultimately created space for relationship and purpose I could never have envisioned when first excluded from my grandson's activities. Not being invited to his graduation had prompted anonymous investment in his education that evolved into shared mission extending far beyond our family circumstances. The scholarship created from hurt and separation had generated not just educational opportunity for dozens of deserving students, but healing and reconciliation within our own family, transforming rejection into connection more meaningful than what had been lost. In responding to exclusion with generosity rather than resentment, I had discovered that sometimes the most powerful gifts emerge from our most painful experiences, not despite those difficulties, but because of how we choose to transform them into unexpected possibility. 4 years had passed since that pivotal moment when I discovered my grandson's scholarship application during my volunteer work at the college library. What began as a desperate attempt to ensure Ethan's education despite family estrangement had evolved into something far more significant than I could have imagined. A foundation that had now supported over 60 students, a research center, advancing educational access policy, and most precious to me, restored family relationships built on authentic connection rather than obligation. The James Parker Education Foundation's annual celebration had become a highlight of Westfield's academic calendar, a gathering that brought together current and former scholars, faculty partners, institutional collaborators, and community representatives. This year's event held particular significance as we prepared to announce a major expansion of our programs based on research Ethan had developed through his now completed doctoral work. At 79, I found myself experiencing this milestone with complex emotions, pride in what we had accomplished, gratitude for reconciliation that once seemed impossible, and a bittersweet awareness that James wasn't physically present to witness his legacy's remarkable evolution. Yet his presence remained palpable in the Foundation's guiding philosophy, and in Ethan's increasingly confident embodiment of values that connected grandfather and grandson across time. The celebration venue had been moved from campus to Westfield's historic Baldwin Theater, the Foundation's growth having outpaced even the college's largest reception spaces. As I entered the beautifully restored 1920s building, Claire appeared at my side, her attention to detail evident in the evening's arrangements. "The governor's representative just arrived," she informed me, her professional composure now directed toward advancing the Foundation's mission rather than maintaining social appearances. "And the Chronicle of Higher Education journalist wants a few minutes with you and Ethan before the program begins." Claire's transformation over these years had been remarkable. The financial collapse that destroyed her family's wealth had ultimately liberated her from appearances she'd been conditioned to maintain since childhood. Working with the Foundation, initially in fundraising, eventually as development director, had connected her to purpose beyond status. Our relationship remained somewhat formal but had developed genuine respect that would have been unimaginable during the years of estrangement. "Everything looks beautiful, Claire," I acknowledged, taking in the tasteful decorations that incorporated the Foundation's colors and symbols. "Is Ethan here yet?" Backstage reviewing his presentation, Robert's with him. She paused, something vulnerable briefly crossing her expression. "Eleanor, before everyone arrives, I want you to know how deeply I appreciate being allowed to participate in this work. After what I did, separating you from Ethan all those years, the Foundation has always been about building future possibilities rather than remaining trapped in past hurts," I reminded her gently. "Your contributions have been invaluable." It was true. Claire's organizational skills, social connections, and growing commitment to educational access had significantly advanced the Foundation's mission. What began as tentative involvement following the family's financial collapse had evolved into genuine dedication that sometimes surprised even her. As guests filled the theater's elegant lobby, I found myself surrounded by James Parker scholars. Across multiple graduating classes, young people whose lives had been transformed through educational opportunity, and who were now extending that transformation to their communities and professions. Marcus Williams, one of our original scholarship recipients now completing medical school, approached with characteristic enthusiasm. "Ms. Parker, I wanted you to meet someone." He gestured to a teenage girl beside him. "This is my sister Kiana, who just received her acceptance to Westfield for the fall. She'll be applying for the Community Scholars Program." "That's wonderful news, Kiana," I responded warmly. "Your brother has set quite an example." "He's why I believed college was possible for me," she explained. "Watching him succeed made it real." This interaction captured exactly what our research had documented: how targeted educational support created ripple effects beyond individual recipients, transforming family and community expectations. What had begun as a scholarship for my grandson had generated expanding circles of impact I could never have anticipated when first establishing the anonymous fund. Before the formal program began, Ethan found me in the growing crowd. At 24, he had matured into a poised young man whose professional accomplishments were increasingly recognized in educational policy circles. His dissertation on intergenerational educational mobility had received national awards, leading to multiple academic job offers. Yet he had chosen to divide his time between teaching at Westfield and directing the Foundation's research division, a balance between theory and practice that honored his grandfather's approach to scholarly work. "Grandma," he greeted me warmly, the term now comfortable after years of rebuilding our relationship. "There's someone I want you to meet before we start." He introduced me to a young woman with intelligent eyes and a warm smile. "This is Sophia Chen, my colleague from the policy research team at Princeton. She's joining us as the Foundation's new associate director." Something in his expression and the way he included her in this moment suggested their relationship extended beyond professional collaboration. I welcomed her with genuine interest, noting how Ethan remained attentive to her responses and perspectives as our conversation unfolded. Later, as we moved toward our seats for the evening program, Robert confirmed my suspicions. "Sophia's special to him," he commented quietly. "They've been seeing each other for about 6 months, but he wanted to be certain before making any official introductions. She seems lovely," I observed, "and clearly shares his commitment to educational equity." That's what connected them initially, collaborative research that evolved into something more personal. She challenges his thinking while supporting his core values. Robert smiled reflectively. Dad would have approved of someone who engages both his heart and mind. The observation touched me deeply. Robert acknowledging his father's values with appreciation, rather than the ambivalence that had characterized their relationship during Claire's years of social striving. The financial collapse that had initially seemed catastrophic had ultimately freed my son to rediscover authentic priorities that aligned more closely with his upbringing than the materialism Claire had prioritized during their early marriage. As the formal program began, I took my seat, beside Robert and Claire in the front row. The stage featured photographs of James throughout his academic career, alongside images of foundation scholars and community programs, a visual representation of how one life's values continued expanding through subsequent generations. Dr. Abigail, Washington, Westfield's president, opened the evening with remarks acknowledging the foundation's growing impact on educational access throughout the region. What began as a modest scholarship fund honoring a beloved professor has evolved into a comprehensive initiative transforming how institutions approach educational opportunity, she noted. The research developed through the Foundation's work has influenced admission policies at 17 colleges and universities in our consortium alone. This external validation of our impact felt particularly meaningful. Confirmation that the Foundation's influence extended far beyond direct scholarships to systemic changes affecting thousands of students. What had begun as my private response to family estrangement had evolved into public benefit, exceeding anything I could have envisioned. When Ethan took the stage as the evening's keynote speaker, I felt James's presence with unusual clarity, not just in our grandson's physical resemblance to him, but in the intellectual passion and social commitment that animated his presentation. The values that Claire had once systematically excluded from Ethan's life now defined his professional identity and personal mission. Educational opportunity creates possibilities that extend far beyond individual advancement, he began, unconsciously echoing phrases from James's academic writing that he had discovered years after developing similar perspectives independently. When we remove financial barriers to quality education, we don't just transform individual lives. We change family trajectories, community expectations, and ultimately, social structures that perpetuate inequality. His presentation integrated personal narrative, rigorous research, and compelling vision for the Foundation's future. The expansion he announced, establishing regional centers implementing the Community Scholars Model in 5 additional underserved areas, represented significant scaling of our impact based on documented outcomes from the original program. Most meaningful to me was watching Ethan articulate a philosophy of education that seamlessly integrated his grandfather's core values with contemporary research methodologies and his own developing perspective. The intellectual legacy I had feared lost during the years of estrangement had not only survived but evolved through our grandson in ways that honored its origin while extending its relevance. As the formal program concluded and guests moved to the theater's grand ballroom for the reception, I found myself approached by a distinguished older gentleman I recognized as a prominent education philanthropist who had recently made substantial contributions to our expansion efforts. "Mrs. Parker," he greeted me warmly, "I wanted to personally express my admiration for what you've built with this foundation. Your response to family estrangement by creating educational opportunity for others represents remarkable transformation of personal difficulty into public benefit." His comment highlighted the journey's extraordinary arc. from private hurt to expanding public good, from individual exclusion to institutional inclusion, from anonymous gift born of rejection to celebrated, legacy extending beyond family reconciliation. The estrangement that once seemed solely destructive had, through choices made in response to that pain, created opportunities for meaningful impact beyond anything I could have anticipated. As the evening progressed, I observed Ethan moving confidently among guests, engaging with scholars about their experiences, discussing research implications with academic partners, introducing Sophia to foundation supporters. His natural integration of relational warmth with intellectual rigor reminded me powerfully of James at similar academic gatherings, though Ethan had developed his own distinctive approach to leadership that reflected contemporary context and perspective. Late in the evening, as the crowd began thinning, Ethan approached with Sophia beside him. "Grandma, would you join us for coffee? There's something I'd like to discuss away from the event chaos." We settled in a quiet corner of Westfield's historic hotel lobby, just the three of us with steaming cups and the comfortable ease that develops when people share fundamental values despite generational differences. After brief conversation about the evening's success, Ethan reached for Sophia's hand in a gesture that confirmed my earlier impressions about their relationship. "I wanted to share something with you first, before making any public announcements," he began, his expression reflecting both excitement and thoughtful consideration. "Sophia and I have been discussing the Foundation's future direction, particularly how we might extend its impact internationally while maintaining deep commitment to our existing communities." What followed was a carefully considered vision for global expansion, collaborative educational access initiatives in selected regions facing significant barriers to higher education. The proposal reflected both ambitious scope and practical implementation grounded in the Foundation's established approach. "We've been developing this concept for months," Sophia explained, her academic expertise evident in how she framed both possibilities and challenges. Educational barriers aren't uniquely American issues. The same dynamics appear globally, though specific contexts require culturally appropriate applications of core principles. As they outlined preliminary research, potential partners, and implementation timelines, I realized this conversation represented something beyond professional planning. The "we" they used reflected partnership extending beyond foundation work, a shared vision indicating commitment to both professional collaboration and personal future. When they finished presenting the international initiative concept, Ethan's expression softened from professional focus to personal warmth. "There's something else I wanted to share with you tonight, before telling anyone else." He glanced at Sophia, who nodded encouragement. "We're engaged. We decided last weekend, but wanted you to be the first to know." The announcement brought immediate tears to my eyes. Not just happiness for their relationship, but profound appreciation for being included in this significant moment. After years of exclusion from my grandson's major life events, this intentional sharing of important news before wider announcement represented healing I had once thought impossible. "James would have adored you," I told Sophia, reaching for her hand. "Your commitment to education as transformation rather than mere credential, your engagement with both ideas and people, these qualities would have resonated deeply with him. I feel I know him through his writing and Ethan's stories," she responded. "His perspective has influenced my own work, even though we never met." This recognition, James's values continuing through not just his grandson but potentially future generations, felt like completion of a circle broken during those years of estrangement. What once seemed irretrievably lost had been not just recovered but expanded through reconciliation that created new possibilities rather than merely restoring previous relationships. "We're thinking about a small wedding next spring," Ethan continued. "Something intimate at the house, if that would be all right with you. It feels appropriate to begin our marriage in the place where Grandpa's legacy has been preserved and extended." The request, to host this significant life event in the home where James and I had built our life together, held meaning beyond practical venue considerations. It represented Ethan's desire to integrate past and future, to acknowledge family, continuity despite the years of separation, to build new beginnings firmly connected to meaningful foundations. Nothing would make me happier, I assured them both. Your grandfather would be overjoyed to have his home filled with new beginnings that honor what came before while creating something entirely their own. As our conversation continued, discussing wedding possibilities, international program development, and the Foundation's evolving mission, I reflected on the extraordinary journey from exclusion to inclusion, from rejection to reconciliation, from anonymous scholarship to intergenerational legacy. The choice I had made years earlier, responding to estrangement with anonymous generosity rather than bitterness, had created possibilities I could never have anticipated when first learning about Ethan's college financial needs. The scholarship foundation established to ensure his education had evolved into his professional passion. The anonymous gift had become collaborative family mission, and the relationship once systematically severed had been not just restored, but transformed into something more authentic than what had been lost. Later that night, after returning home to the house where James and I had shared our lives, where Ethan now regularly stayed during his foundation work in Westfield, I sat in my husband's study surrounded by the books and papers that had shaped his academic career. The shelves now included Ethan's doctoral dissertation, scholarly articles, and foundation research publications. 3 generations of educational values preserved and extended through evolving perspective. On James's desk, I kept a framed photograph, taken during one of our foundation celebrations, Ethan and me standing beside the official portrait of James that hung in the research center named for him. 3 generations connected through values that had transcended even deliberate separation, through commitment to education as transformation that had ultimately transformed our own family relationships. The journey from I wasn't invited to my grandson's graduation to my grandson invited me first to share news of his engagement represented healing that extended far beyond restored contact. Through responding to exclusion with generosity rather than resentment, I had discovered that rejection sometimes creates opportunities for connection more meaningful than what was initially lost. The anonymous scholarship established when family estrangement seemed permanent had evolved into multi-generational commitment to values transcending our particular circumstances. The foundation created to support one student's education despite family conflict now influenced institutional policies affecting thousands, while simultaneously healing the very family breach that prompted its creation. Most significantly, the future now unfolding before us, Ethan and Sophia's engagement, planned international program expansion, continuing research influence, represented legacy extending far beyond what might have developed through conventional family relationships, untested by separation and reconciliation. The estrangement that once seemed solely destructive had, through choices made in response to that pain, created possibility for meaning and impact exceeding what uninterrupted connection might have yielded. As I prepared for bed that night, I paused before the family photographs lining the hallway. Images spanning decades from James's and my early marriage through Robert's childhood, then jumping across years of separation to recent foundation celebrations, and family gatherings that had gradually filled the gap created by estrangement. Soon, wedding photographs would join this visual timeline, followed perhaps by images of another generation who would know their great-grandfather not through direct experience, but through values preserved and extended by those who carried his legacy forward. The story that began with painful exclusion, I wasn't invited to my grandson's graduation, had evolved through anonymous generosity into reconciliation that created new forms of connection rather than merely restoring what had been lost. The scholarship established to ensure my grandson's education despite family estrangement had generated expanding circles of impact, touching dozens of students directly while influencing institutional policies, affecting thousands more. Most precious. Of all, the values that Claire had once systematically excluded from Ethan's life now defined his professional identity, personal relationships, and future aspirations. The educational legacy she had dismissed as impractical idealism compared to financial ambition had ultimately provided stability and purpose that transcended material success or failure. At 79, I could look back on the painful years of exclusion with something approaching gratitude for the unexpected gifts they had ultimately yielded. By responding to rejection with anonymous generosity rather than bitterness or withdrawal, I had created possibilities for healing and purpose exceeding anything I could have imagined when first excluded from my grandson's life. Not being invited to his graduation had prompted creation of a scholarship foundation that now supported his wedding plans and professional mission. The anonymous gift established from hurt and separation had generated not just educational opportunity for dozens of deserving students, but healing and reconciliation within our own family, transforming rejection into connection more meaningful than what had been lost. As I drifted toward sleep, I found myself thinking of James and his favorite quotation from Viktor Frankl that he often shared with students facing difficulties. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. The estrangement had been the stimulus. The anonymous scholarship was my chosen response. Everything that followed, the foundation's growth, Ethan's educational journey, our eventual reconciliation, and now his engagement celebrated in our home, had emerged from that initial choice to respond to exclusion with generosity rather than resentment. In that choice, made during a moment of pain when other responses might have seemed more natural, lay the seeds of everything meaningful that followed. Not because the estrangement itself held positive value, but because the response it prompted created possibilities that transformed rejection into unexpected connection, exclusion into expanded inclusion, and private hurt into public benefit, extending far beyond our particular family circumstances. The journey from "I wasn't invited to my grandson's graduation" to "my grandson wants to be married in my home" represented not just personal healing, but profound insight into how responding to life's most painful moments can create possibilities exceeding anything we might imagine during our darkest hours. By choosing generosity when exclusion might have justified bitterness, I had discovered that sometimes our greatest contributions emerge from our deepest wounds, not despite those difficulties, but because of how we transform them into unexpected blessing. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.